So we are on chapter 18 of your U.S. history. Last section, section 4, the great century of Christianity. Yes, indeed. During this time, it's like the Church of Philadelphia in the Bible. That we had a lot of missionaries in the United States. There was a lot of revivals going on, a lot of people coming to Jesus, growing churches, church organizations forming, evangelism and home missions and foreign missions, even down to we talking about the Red Cross during this time with Clara Barton. So let's begin. Growing churches. So church membership grew rapidly, and there were many new denominations forming. Annual revivals became commonplace. There was money for evangelism, and again, people went into missions and sharing the gospel. Laymen's organizations spread Christianity, basically people getting out and giving the gospel, the circuit riders and such. Methodist and Baptist were the two largest groups involved in evangelism, along with the Presbyterians too. The older meeting houses were made into new buildings. They had before the tent meetings, and now they would go into these churches with steeples and bells. And a lot of churches were built. Pipe organs. Remember I told you about Carnegie? He made sure that a lot of churches donated pipe organs to their church. And so pipe organs became many of the main instruments involved in the church, in church worship, I should say. Camp meetings turned into permanent cottages where they would meet for camp meetings out in the wilderness and had put up tents. Now they put up little cabins and met. The church organization, a lot of rescue missions. Through the church, they developed these missions. One known was the Pacific Garden Mission in Chicago in 1877. So as you can see some of these pictures of the garden, the Pacific Garden Mission. On to that, they also had the Salvation Army. I'm sure you've heard of the Salvation Army, right? It was organized in England by General William Booth. 1829 to 1912 is when he lived. So he lived in Great Britain in 1878 and organized the Salvation Army. It started as a church organization, but brought in help for those that were in destitute. Help. Salvation Army came through in many situations, providing food and clothing and such. It was rebuilding the people of unfortunate circumstance. So they brought in to have food, bring in food and shelter, clothing, and gospel presentation in a gospel mission type situation. And they came on to America in 1879 from England, calling themselves Salvation Army. And General William Booth actually came to America during that time. So I don't know if you saw my video on Lady Hope, and she was involved in doing this, but that's a different video. So also another organization that was organized during this time was the YMCA and the YWCA, Young Men's Christian Association and Young Women's Christian Association. In 1870, they started with these organizations on the campuses of the college campuses. And so this would be a place where young Christian men and women could come, they could meet each other, they'd have a place to stay, they would be able to do sports together, recreation together, and became known across the country. And in most cities, and even out in small towns, that would have a YMCA or a YWCA. And these all came from the church. Christian education was also coming in the midst of grammar schools and trade schools and college, all based on Christian education. And colleges then taught biblical truth. Now, since then, we see it differently. But in the beginning, even the public school systems, they based themselves on reading the Bible and prayer. Native American education also came as the Native Americans were evangelized. And I know in the midst of that, as our great-grandfather, Artemis Ahanamani, in the midst of Santee, led many to Jesus. And doing this brought in education for the reservations. And also help for the poor in the South. So in the South, as you can see, they developed schools and trade schools and such for those freed slaves in the midst. And so we have Christian education coming alive during this time. Evangelism and home missions. Well, we have to go for the great evangelism of D.L. Moody during this time. So Dwight L. Moody was America's best known evangelist of the whole 19th century. So remember him, D.L. Moody. His father died when he was only 4 years old. He had 8 siblings, and he was raised in poverty by his mother. One of his uncles had a shoe business. He ended up going and meeting a Sunday school teacher, Kimball, who was a school teacher who gave his life to Jesus during Sunday school. So he gave his life to Jesus during Sunday school, maybe like you guys have, during a Sunday school meeting, praying to receive Jesus. He says, faith makes all things possible, and love makes all things easy. Isn't that true? With faith, God can do all things. And with love, everything goes easier. So D.L. Moody centered his work in Chicago. He started as a YMCA worker and a Sunday school teacher. And then he started sharing the gospel and people started getting saved. Ira Sankey, a friend of his, became his song leader. And so when he was preaching, he would come out, Ira Sankey would sing, and it would bring in many. And then we have crowds. See this crowd here? Huge crowds forming to come to his evangelical meetings. Moody said he wanted to go to the cities because these cities are the center of influence and water runs downhill, and the highest hill are the great cities. If we can stir these cities up, the whole country will be stirred with the gospel, right? So he went to New York City, he went to Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. He went to all of these cities. In fact, he kept going and having his revivals in all these cities up into even going to Europe and bringing in revivals in the European countries, especially in Great Britain. So he had a very clear, simple gospel presentation, and thousands and thousands and thousands came to Christ. He started an institute called Moody Bible Institute that prepared young people for Christian service. D.L. Moody, one of the greatest evangelists during this time. Also, T. DeWitt Talmage, who lived 1832 to 1902, and he was the pastor of the Central Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn, New York, and he spoke to huge audiences, more than any other preacher. In fact, his sermons were published in 3,500 different newspapers. So you're talking about a lot of people hearing the gospel of Talmage. So even more than Moody, he presented his gospel to great crowds of people. Sam Jones lived 1847 to 1906, and he was a Methodist circuit rider. What's a circuit rider? He would ride a horse through town to town preaching the gospel, right? He was an evangelist from Georgia, from the South, and he toured the American cities and preached revival and godly living in the South. In fact, he's called the Moody of the South, or D.L. Moody of the South, because as he was preaching the gospel, many people were coming to the Lord. So here's some pictures of Sam Jones in the South Just remember, like Moody of the South. So we have Moody in the north, and we have Sam Jones in the south, and Talmage, and great revivals happening during this time. Many people coming to the Lord, many people going into Christian service and mission fields. B.H. Carroll, 1843 to 1914, was a Baptist preacher. He was an evangelist and author, but he's known for his multi-volume commentary on the Bible, the interpretation of the English Bible. So everyone wanted to get his commentary. So legacy series of B.H. Carroll. Home missions. So now going home. Home missions are missions in the United States. And then we have foreign missions, right? So home missions were in the rural areas of America, in the small farming areas. There became a Sunday school movement. And in the West, this Sunday school movement drew into the states of Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. They were all involved in this movement of home missions into Sunday schools for children, child evangelism. Also, they started into the Oklahoma Territory, which had a lot of different Indian reservations too, and the Native American missionaries came in to lead the Native American to the Lord. A lot of Indians, especially I could look back at my history, my great-grandfather being a native pastor of a church, and spoke in Mdewakan Sioux, Artemisahana. So during this time, there were a lot of Native Americans coming to the Lord, and the missionaries went to a lot of their reservations. Now, some of them did a good job, some of them did a poor job. So I'm not saying as the myths, but a lot of people were led to the Lord. In Alaska, in the gold rush in the 1890s were followed. The gold rush, as people went up searching for gold, the missionaries followed them, searching for believers. Actually, searching for fishermen, being that fishermen of men, right? Sharing the gospel. So whenever you would have these gold rushes, you'd have missionaries following them and preaching the gospel to the people going into Alaska, along as Alaska, and even when they went into California, the same thing happened. But the gold rush of Alaska happened in the 1890s. There weren't very many mission fields, missionaries, I should say, in Alaska before that time. In 1898, missionaries went to Hawaii, and they also went to Puerto Rico. Sheldon Jackson lived 1834 to 1909. And he was a Presbyterian pastor that served the remote areas of America. So first, he went in to be a missionary in the Oklahoma Territory for Native Americans. And he then started churches in West Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Dakotas, in the South Dakota and North Dakota, and Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. 800 churches in all. That's a lot of churches. And he spent most of his time after 1877 as a missionary to Alaska. So in 1884, the permission was to start public school in Alaska. So as he spent his time in Alaska, towards the end of his life, he also introduced the reindeer to Alaska. He brought reindeer from Siberia, 171 of them, to Alaska. You know, basically the reindeer being very prominent in food and supplies and such, and the reindeer being that hardy type of deer or ox figure for in Siberia. Now he brought the reindeer, and 640,000 of them were in 1930. There was at least 640,000 of them then in Alaska. So they went from 171 to 640,000 reindeer in Alaska. So talk about reindeer, you know, when you think of the whole thing of Santa Claus and the reindeer, but Sheldon Jackson brought him to Alaska from Siberia. Foreign missions. That was missionaries sent out of the country. So D.L. Moody put together foreign missions, a mission outreach for young people to be missionaries. And a lot of them went from the Moody Institute into the mission field in foreign countries other than the United States. In 1886, there was a Christian conference at Mount Hermon, Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, they had 251 American college students that came, and 100 of them dedicated themselves to foreign missions. They call this the Mount Hermon 100. And at Mount Hermon 100, they went about recruiting other college students from all different colleges to go into foreign missions and they sent over 2,000 students out to give the gospel in foreign countries. And the missions came from various college campuses all over, and they met with this 100 Mount Hermon, and they decided where and prayed. God decided, they prayed for where they should go. And this became known as the Student Volunteer Movement, sending evangelists into the world for this whole generation. They said, the evangelism of the world has begun. And indeed it did. Because we call this century, this 19th century, from 1860 on to the 1900s, early 1900s, is the church, like the Church of Philadelphia in the Bible, sending out missionaries and presenting the gospel on every continent. So in 1915, they sent 5,000 young men and women to foreign lands, and America took the lead in influencing the world with the gospel of Jesus Christ to the farthest corners of the world. So in the 19th century was indeed the great century of Christianity. Just remember that. Despite all of the things going on in politics, despite the tariffs, and despite the strikes, and despite the labor strike and the riots, and despite all that was going on with the presidencies during this time, in the midst of all this, we had the gospel going forth magnificently in the United States of America. So that's the end of this chapter, and we'll get in more about this time called the Gilded Age, and we'll talk more politically during this time, and also going in to talk about the West and how the West was won, and what happened in the midst with the Native Americans and the cowboys and such. And so we're going to get into another aspect in chapter 19. So, one last thing I forgot, and that was about the American Red Cross forming. Clara Barton, this is in your book, she lived 1821 to 1912, and she founded the American Red Cross. She had a life dedicated to relieve suffering. She went, in the Civil War, she was a battlefield nurse of wounded soldiers, and President Lincoln requested her to organize a bureau to locate missing soldiers. So her deal was basically, she was there for the wounded soldiers, and then she was worried about the missing soldiers. She went out to find those that were missing in action and organized people to do so. In 1869, Clara went to Europe on the nurse front lines of the Franco-Prussian War again, and there she was impressed with the International Red Cross. And she saw the Red Cross there, wanting to bring the Red Cross to America, calling it the American Red Cross. So in 1873, she returned to the United States, and she did establish the branch of the American Red Cross in America from what she saw was going on in the war in Europe. How they needed to have, in the midst of wartime, they need to have medical supplies and help come in. And she put in 1881, the American Red Cross was founded, and Clara Barton became the first president of the American Red Cross until 1904. The American Red Cross was also not just for war, in times of war, but she also put forth it to be available for natural disasters, like hurricanes and fires and, other disasters that can happen in the midst, even during the times of strikes and all these other things that would go on. Anything where people would be wounded or people would be hurt, she would basically send out the American Red Cross to aid people in peacetime emergencies and during war. So, we're going to continue on to the next chapter.